I mean, I think our priors are pretty strong that we're going to see AI facilitate business in many, many different ways,
Yeah.
right? And in the nonprofit sector, we could just start reeling off ways in which we can improve the efficiency of our operations, right? On the other side, at the core of most nonprofits is the human aspect of what we do, right? It's understanding those human problems that we're solving. And even we spend most of our time really getting into the weeds about those fundamental core, whether it's ethical or social or other kind of problems that we're trying to solve from a human, not algorithmic perspective.
I am very happy today to be joined by a researcher, leader, and entrepreneur in the fields of artificial intelligence and finance, and the CEO at AI for Good Foundation and Chief Science Officer at Cognism, and someone who has now tolerated quite the run-on sentence, James Hodson. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Jack. Very happy to be part of this.
Also sitting on the call, we have the VP of Operations, Tia Christopher, who might chime in. Who knows? This is a free-flowing conversation. She might be a great resource for anything we bring up. Tia, welcome to you as well.
Thank you very much, Jack.
No problem. So my first question is for you, James. I believe last year you did an interview and you mentioned that the pandemic has the potential to create big shocks that might breed innovation. What nonprofit technological innovations have you observed in this time while we've been in the pandemic?
Well, yeah. So it's, I think shocks in general breed innovation, right? That's it's a general truth about the way human beings work, right? We're faced with adversity, we find solutions to the problems that appear. We're driven in some way to find solutions when there are frictions that we're faced with. In general, in the pandemic over the last 18 months or so, obviously a lot of the energy has been focused on new ways to do business, new ways to communicate, new ways to innovate, right? In the economics literature on innovation, teams tend to innovate, right? And certain types of teams innovate more than other teams. But even when you look at patents, right, teams tend to be more prolific at generating patents. So we'd expect more innovation when people are able to work closely together. However, if you look at the sectors that are generating innovations, patents, right, new technology over the last year and a half, it hasn't slowed down, right? Which means those sectors have been innovating in how they work. They found ways to work remotely together. They found ways to still bring new products to market. So new kind of product-led growth hasn't really slowed down over the past year and a half. And that's true also in the nonprofit sector, right? So we have found ways to bring more of our services online into a digital arena, which in some sense was kind of the kick in the groin that we needed in order to stop being paper-based, right? A lot of interventions were still relying on offline resources in order to keep track of people in the field, right? In order to keep track of donors, in order to be able to look up information about historic grantees, about foundations that are partnering with your organization. In the last year, if you haven't moved to it being digital, you've probably been hurting your organization from a fundraising perspective. It's as simple as that. I think that's where most of the innovation that I've seen has been. I guess we'll get into this with some of the other questions, but it's one thing I should say overall, right? We're an AI nonprofit. So AI is kind of the first layer that covers everything that we do. So for us, it's less about where do we embed AI, but we're actually building kind of the kinds of systems that help us to solve the problems that are at the core of our mission. So it's a little bit different from the general, how would you embed AI into the nonprofit sector for us on a day-to-day basis. Some of the research that we do is related to how AI is impacting the workforce, how it's impacting firms and the way that firms do business and innovation practices. One thing I just want to kind of bring up front in this conversation, because I think it's important, is that so far, the only firms that have seen growth, okay, and I'm going to explain what I mean, from the introduction of artificial intelligence technologies into their operations, into the capital investments that they're making, are the largest firms in the most tech-heavy sectors. Guess what? That doesn't include nonprofits, okay?
Yeah.
So the kinds of, and even those firms are seeing zero productivity gains on net, right, across these industries from the introduction of AI so far. Might be many reasons for that. Might be that AI is not going to produce productivity advances. Might be that it just takes a long time. You make an investment, you've got a lot of really expensive people that are working on this stuff. And at some point, it's going to come back up and it's going to give you big productivity gains. For the last 10 years, we haven't seen any so far. So, I'm going to caveat all of this conversation with, now is probably not the time where you'd expect nonprofits would have the capability to get productivity gains from broad forays into artificial intelligence capital investments. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't places where you can leverage AI in order to do better than what you're doing today, right? It just means that you should be aware that AI is not quite the future of nonprofit right now, right?
Yeah, and I think people can't afford to wait for that curve right now. Like you were saying, you can't invest hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, whatever it may be, to wait for these mysterious returns that maybe could come at another time.
I mean, I think our priors are pretty strong that we're going to see AI facilitate business in many, many different ways, right? And in the nonprofit sector, we could just start reeling off ways in which we can improve the efficiency of our operations, right? On the other side, at the core of most nonprofits is the human aspect of what we do, right? It's understanding those human problems that we're solving. And even we spend most of our time really getting into the weeds about those fundamental core, whether it's ethical or social or other kind of problems that we're trying to solve from a human, not algorithmic perspective, right?
Yeah. And I think that transitions nicely into one of my questions, which is, what are some ways that small to mid-sized nonprofits can implement AI in those targeted ways that you were suggesting?
Right. So the first thing I'm going to do is change my hat for a second, put on my chief science officer hat for Cognism, and say that, when it comes to sales and marketing intelligence, there's a huge gap, right, between systematic outreach and random, right? Random marketing on website plus like hoping that people are going to see your brand, right? Nowadays, the gap between those firms that are actually understanding what emails they're sending, right, whom they're reaching out to, building their account-based marketing panels, building their kind of buying panels, like understanding whom they need to talk to in order to really get the decisions going. That is just a big delta between those who know the organization they're doing outreach to and the ones who don't. The ones who know when to send the email, how those people get triggered, how they get kind of brought into that mind space where they're ready to buy, or in our case, give, right? That's just a huge difference between the companies that are doing it, the nonprofits that are doing it well, and the ones that aren't doing it that well. AI for Good Foundation, for instance, sits as one of those that is not doing it so well right now. We're not great at doing that. We have core supporters. We don't do outreach too well, but it's something that we're currently changing with the help of AI, because that's what allows us then to see which cadences are working, right?
Yeah.
What types of people are responding better to different messages that we're putting out there, right? Historically, who is the most likely to be converted to being a donor based on the programs that we talk to them about, when we outreach to them, the industry that they're in. Even just doing phone outreach, there are entire AI-based solutions out there that allow you to coordinate that a whole lot better than you could before, and with a fraction of the staff that you would have needed before. So you've got cost gains, efficiency gains, and more donors per dollar spent, which can come out of that. And these are off-the-shelf solutions, right? So it's not something where you need the skill in-house to build.
Yeah.
I think given how much nonprofits rely on the fundraising aspect in order to fuel the mission, that's kind of the biggest area where we're going to see gains, right? The Red Cross is probably not going to see huge gains in the field, right, in terms of their interventions from the introduction of AI. Maybe there will be some stuff around, predictive, management of people who get sick and stuff like this. It's marginal, right? Because they specialize in that skill. They've got the experts already. But when it comes to those back office functions, there's just a huge potential to do better. I'd say that's number one.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree. What are some internal alignments necessary to implement AI or machine learning into a nonprofit? What mindset do people have to start getting into?
Well, so you need to understand your business model first, right? A lot of this comes down to knowing what processes you actually implement as an organization, right? So if you're going to have a kind of process-driven change or technology-driven change within your organization, you first have to understand where you're starting from. And nonprofits do this pretty poorly in general, right? We don't necessarily have well-defined processes for each business unit in a nonprofit. It's more ad hoc on average than you would see in industry. And it's because we don't maybe have as much pressure, it's not as regulated, right? There are reasons why it might not be as efficient as you would see in the for-profit market in many instances. So once you understand exactly what you're trying to solve, obviously you need to understand whether you have data resources internally that can support that kind of decision making directly.
Yeah.
Right. And data is the fuel for all of this. It's possible to do AI without data if you're a symbolic learning person from the 1970s. If you're not, right, and you're not doing more kind of semantic oriented, common sense reasoning type AI, which pretty much nobody in industry is doing today, then you need data. And often you need a lot of data, which means if your own kind of data repositories and your own data collection mechanisms have not been in place for a while, it's probably not going to give you much benefit to try to implement a statistical model on top of that right now. You'd be better served by putting those processes in place, collecting the data, right, making sure it's clean, making sure that everybody who has a hand in collecting data understands why they're doing it, and they're doing it consistently, so that you don't come up later with data's not fit for use, has biases, you might have ethical concerns depending upon what kind of data you're collecting. All of these things are not AI, but they're integral to not getting slapped in the face later when you're trying to put some algorithmic process in place over the top. Those are the main ingredients that you need. Also bear in mind, nonprofits are never going to be able to hire the PhDs that Google is hiring. And they're not going to be able to pay those $500,000, $600,000 a year for these people. So a lot of what we're going to end up doing in the nonprofit world is off the shelf with small adjustments, except in cases where the AI portion is mission critical to the scalability. One example of that would be one of our partners, the World Resource Institute. They have several interventions where they're doing kind of counting trees, tree species identification, large scale land audits from satellite and mid-level kind of aerial photography. Those are areas where obviously, if you can scale from a human process, identifying this as an oak tree, right, to machine process, you can go from one of my square blocks in Berkeley to entirety of West Coast in a matter of no time at all. That's a mission critical application where scale matters a lot, and there's an obvious inroad for the AI piece, right? Because computer vision has made leaps and bounds over the last few years. The data is massive and available, and that's what they do, right? That's actually solving the problem that they do, that they're interested in solving. Aside from the small number of those types of very, very good fits, most nonprofits are going to be in that collection phase, right? Sorting out their internal procedures and auditing so that they can be sure that it's going to work well in 3-5 years' time.
Yeah, and I think you highlighted a key challenge, and we can talk about some key challenges for implementing AI, but one is the funding, like you mentioned, and another is if you get the funding, it likely won't be applied to programmatic functions. It'll be applied to fundraising. From what I've seen, everything in the nonprofit world starts with fundraising, and then it can be applied to program, because there's a direct link between a cost benefit analysis with fundraising and technology than there is with programs and technology.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the hope would be that as we transition more into a world that is digitally enabled and digitally connecting people, and we're getting there, right? Although many of our stakeholder groups in developing countries are still excluded from that.
Yeah.
Many more of the services that nonprofits provide, especially when you think about health sector or critical services that are kind of one-on-one services with human beings, the more of those we can move into a digital age. Just consider the access potential of that, right? And the equity enhancing aspect of that can be enormous. But it's true, right, that convincing stakeholders and foundations that are giving you grants that you want to build that technology infrastructure because it's going to help you scale your business in a couple of years, it's not a conversation that anybody really wants to have.
It's a long fuse, and we don't know how big the explosion is. So it's hard.
Are we going to be around to use it when it's ready?
Exactly.
Right. So it's a tough sell. And you're right that as a result, it's a safer investment in many cases to put that money towards more fundraising, towards kind of better understanding of how to do the fundraising. One might argue, I would argue strongly, that it's kind of morally speaking, we have an obligation to use the most efficient processes that we can find for our mission critical applications. Some of the time that will be AI. Not all of the time, but some of the time AI will be the right solution. And if that's the case, I think we need to encourage leaders in the nonprofit world to invest themselves in understanding it better and making it a reality, because nobody else is going to do it. Nobody else is going to do it, right?
No.
So
what are some key ethical considerations that nonprofit professionals should keep in mind to use AI responsibly, but not even AI, let's just say any data-driven technologies or data collection in general? Sorry, that's a very broad, let me refine that a little bit. When you're taking your first steps to collect data, what are some of the first ethical considerations you should keep in mind?
Well, ultimately, you're in charge of protecting the people that you're serving, right? Now, those people might be very, very vulnerable, and very frequently they are. In fact, sometimes they might be people who are not able to determine kind of their own specific path for one reason or another, right? Could be people who are stuck with debilitating illnesses. It might be people who are in prisoner of war camps. Like really, when we're talking about the missions of nonprofits, we're talking about the most vulnerable populations often, the most vulnerable organizations, and often then the institutions that have data about these people that need to be protected more than we need to protect a Netflix user from people finding out what movies they've been watching, right? So in some sense, the responsibility that we get by having this responsibility and kind of this honor to work on kind of these core mission statements that we're creating, right? Not very many people get to work on problems that they find so much at the core of their own belief systems and what they think is important to society, right? And we need to take that responsibility much, much, much further than what the regulatory climate and the frameworks that are in place now do for general industrial purposes, right? Or even for government purposes, because we're much more fragile to how people think about how we're doing business than a government or a for-profit organization would be. So as a result of that, obvious things, right? We need to get informed consent, right, from everybody that we collect detailed data about. We need to be following every single ISO and general government requirement in terms of how we store that data, how we process that data, maintaining geographical consistency of data sets, making sure that models are applied that are fully auditable and transparent. And that includes when we're buying them from third parties, right? There's no excuse to, you cannot say it's IBM. That's not enough, right? In fact, that might be worse than not saying anything. It's really, you know, there is, with great power comes great responsibility, right? That's ultimately, most nonprofits have been thinking about how they protect the needs and the rights of their populations, their stakeholders, all along. What can happen with data collection is these things get overlooked because of the potential efficiency gains that come from the integration of these processes. And you can get carried away sometimes, right? Where you're like, well, I'm just trying to help people, right? They will see that I'm trying to help them, and they'll let me, you know, store their social security numbers and most precious private family details on an unsecured AWS server, right? Because that's what makes it easier for me to share things with other parties that are interested in helping people and being good. But that's not really the case, right?
So it's a rationalization that someone would make to themselves so that they don't have to do the extra work.
And it's more expensive than doing it the wrong way.
But it's the right way.
Investing in the right procedures and protocols and having the right audit channels and hiring those security audits to take place independently, or doing it through your cloud provider, which now is kind of probably the easiest way to do it. You know, basically get your cloud provider to make sure you are audit compliant on all of those things. In the long run, will make you, it will mean that you're doing the right thing. And I think, you know, more than anything else, we care about doing the right thing, hopefully, right? Otherwise, we're not making money, so it's not clear why else we're doing it.
Maybe just to make ourselves feel better, but I hope not. I would also say involve your stakeholders. You can set up an advisory committee. You can set up several mechanisms that will allow them to determine their own future.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, very good.
And that's one thing that we're doing at AI for Good is we have our Council for Good, which is a group of international stakeholders. And we've specifically reached out to people with from different modalities. So we have some directors of nonprofits, we have professors, so the academic realm, as well as people that focus in legal ethics and AI, and, you know, just across the board. And so being transparent, I think, as a nonprofit, and especially when utilizing new technology in the space, is so very important. And so for us, in addition to getting advice from these stakeholders, we are also consistently transparent. And when it comes to ethics, we have been talking internally with our stakeholders about the risk analysis part of ethics. You know, a small error can have drastic implications in the business world. So I look at it in the nonprofit world as, with technology or not, with AI or not, we have our fiduciary responsibility to our donors. And so that needs to be at the core of any work we do. That hasn't changed from you know, the initial soup kitchens to the work that James is spearheading now, we have a fiduciary responsibility to people that support us and support organizations like us, and therefore being transparent, of course, is a huge part of that. And just constantly framing our work and saying, hey, where am I at ethics wise in both the tech and our approach to doing the work?
Yeah. How do you find a good advisory group that has the correct, is a representative group of your stakeholders, but also has the correct competencies in order to inform your decisions, especially with something like AI? It must be very hard to balance those two requirements. Sorry, we almost lost you. Do you?
You asked a very unbalancing question, you see.
Yes, I didn't mean to dig too deeply into the inner workings of the AI for Good Foundation.
My answer was going to be, you ask Tia and it magically happens, but it's difficult, right? And we've spent, as an organization, we were built on a network of consultations with the research and policy and kind of nonprofit communities. So we started as an organization based on the beliefs of a broad set of stakeholders about what was needed and what was currently missing, critically missing from the AI and sustainability goals of United Nations aspects. So for us, we've got a few areas that we can dig into in order to get these expertise. I would say that every organization has its own stakeholder groups, and they are experts in those areas and knowing the right people in those areas. I would guess that given the data-driven society and industry that is kind of evolving everywhere, there are more and more data literate and kind of data ethics literate people who are coming into these circles every year. We're going to converge pretty quickly to a set of international privacy laws and data laws that are going to be not perfect, but 80-90% of the way to what we need to ensure that individuals get the rights that they need to feel comfortable with how companies are going about their business. And that will include how nonprofits are going about their business, but nonprofits will be held under closer scrutiny just because of the nature of the work that they do. So I think each organization is capable of finding the right people. It's not easy, right? It's never easy. It's not easy to hire a board of directors for a nonprofit. It's not easy to do anything as a nonprofit, to be honest, right?
I cannot underline that last statement as enough. I would say that for me, it's when we launched our volunteer network, I have been amazed at the breadth of people who have contacted us, and a huge amount of women, machine learning engineers and policy experts and lawyers. And so that really excited me personally. And I think a lot of the featured stakeholders in AI and in startups aren't necessarily visually representative of everyone out there as stakeholders. So I specifically cast the net really large. So when you go through our advisors, our council, they are representative of every continent and the different aspects of the industry, from people who are, active machine learning engineers to, of course, policymakers. And for us at AI for Good, we marry that policy and our in-house machine learning projects and everything that we do. So therefore, you want all of that there. But it was very important for me, honestly, to have women and people of color as a very significant part of what we're doing. And I want to be a leader and example in nonprofits like ours.
Yeah. And as we're singing the praises of the AI for Good Foundation, I was wondering if you could both tell me an initiative you're both particularly proud of. In the question I sent you, I said, an impact of AI in your work that you were impressed by. But it could just be data-driven technology, something where data-driven technology or AI was used in a way that made you proud or impressed you.
Yeah, it's everything that all of our programs are AI programs for obvious reasons. Yeah. So, and as AI kind of researchers and scientists, I guess we know the bounds of the technology, so we're not necessarily always surprised by the outcome. We wouldn't necessarily we wouldn't necessarily push forward on the project unless we thought we would get some positive outcome from it. I mean, I can state a couple of things that I think are just really interesting uses of AI that we found over the years. One of the first things that we worked on was food security and building more resilient food logistics networks globally. One of the problems within that was that essentially the rate of yield improvement in kind of global staple crops had been plateauing for about 20, 30 years. Part of this was driven by the movement against GMO, right? GMO allowed us to get huge yield improvements year after year because we could literally just rewrite the genome to be optimal for the local conditions and the types of plants that we wanted to grow. But given that, because of the pushback on that, most of the seed development companies, right, which is what farmers ultimately rely on every year to buy their seeds, moved to traditional methods of grafting and crossbreeding, which can take 3 to 5 years to really yield new plants that have been proven. So you've got this 5-year cycle, and the average yield improvement year to year was under 1%. No, under 1% is still bloody good, right? When we think about the amount of food we have to grow in the world. Unfortunately, it was something, don't quote me on the exact number. Well, I guess you will by putting my video out there saying this. I don't remember the exact number, but it was at least 2 or 3 times less than we needed in order to meet the projected needs of the population in 2030. And we're still, on average, our yield improvements are low, right? And we do have nutrition imbalances across the world. Different countries have different access to food networks that they need in order to be self-sufficient and kind of do their best every day as human beings. One of the models that came out of a competition that we ran as part of this program actually ended up doubling the yield improvement rate just by doing better selection of the initial experiments to run in the test fields available, right? So just simple application of statistical selection methodologies on a lot of data that was available and had been available for some years allowed us to basically double the efficiency of the scientific process in the field.
Wow.
And that's not even the limits of it, right? This was a small prototype that's being taken into industry now. It is having an impact, and it's cool, right? Because you kind of see it go all the way through. And now I'll give you just a program that we're building now, which I think has enormous impact potential based on artificial intelligence, and it dovetails with kind of the discussion about diversity and kind of building a workforce that understands, right, all of the issues involved with doing business and can come up with new ideas and innovate faster. And at the core of that is just having a more diverse workforce, right? People who don't necessarily all have the same ideas. And diversity means 100 different attributes of diversity, right? Not just the obvious ones that we need to do something about with urgency, but also along all other dimensions of how somebody is nurtured through their life. And right now, what we're trying to do is build scorecards for companies based on how diverse and how their diversity efforts are having an impact on their internal organizational structures, what programs they put in place. And the AI part of it takes care of measuring this in a consistent way. And we've got some great partners in economics over at UC Berkeley that help us to make sure that we're doing models that are in line with the latest state of the art in the literature. But the cool thing is we're going to be basically allowing consumers to see the scores of companies while they're buying these companies' products. So it's shifting and saying, okay, you say you're being transparent about diversity because you put it into your 10K statement in that paragraph on page 57, which is bullshit because nobody reads that paragraph on page 57. And nobody's making a purchasing decision based on the difference in diversity metrics between Amazon and Target, right? The price discrimination feature is by far the biggest reason that they're buying. Well, what we're going to do is basically put that in your browser. So every time you see a product, you see that company X is a C- on diversity, right? Then do you care about buying from companies that have beliefs that are aligned with you or not, right? So AI is one aspect of it. Obviously, there's the behavioral side of it that really plays a part, right? How do you build that incentive mechanism? How do you make it obvious at the point of decision making? But we think that that has a huge potential to really move the needle on how companies think about diversity by forcing it to be that third leg of their branding.
Fascinating. That's awesome. Tia, is there anything that you've worked on or just been impressed by through the work of the foundation?
So not a program, but I'm consistently blown away because my background is hardcore nonprofits. And yet I'm working daily with, some of the most talented data scientists in the world. It's really humbling to be around them. And I can't believe how incredibly nice everyone is and how much they want to help. I think sometimes people think that technology is cold, and don't necessarily see the human side. And yet I see people that are giving of their time freely every day and really want to help the SDGs and make progress and are so willing to collaborate and do so without any ego. And I think that can't be stressed enough because I think there is a little bit of misunderstanding of the inner workings of this space. And it's something that I get to witness every day. And one of our projects that I get really excited about, again, the lefty nonprofit person over here, is our data catalog project. It's an open source data set catalog to help increase progress in research towards the SDGs and really equalize the research process. And I'm so excited. Our team is building this and really focused, of course, on the security aspects when building open source work and also training data science students while we're doing this. So mentorship is very important to us. So I'm really excited for the data catalog to be launched and for us to really be leaders in helping to equalize research.
That's awesome. Well, thank you both so much for joining me today. I think we touched on a lot of important stuff, and I think things that people can gain a lot of insight from. So thank you both for being here.
I'm very happy to join, and thanks for the opportunity, Jack. It was really a nice conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us, and let us know if we can provide, any resources or info in the future.
Don't promise that, because I will follow up, and I will. You will be sending me terabytes of data.
We don't have any. No, we don't. Sorry, let's go back. Erase that part of the video. We don't have any data.
Well, that is one thing that I do know is a lie. All right. Thank you both for being here.
Okay.